She was 22 and homeless. No family left in the county. No savings. No car. Just a canvas rucksack with a brass telegraph key inside it. And $10 she had earned sorting mail at a post office in Decorah. And with that $10, she bought an old railway depot on a forgotten siding in northeast Iowa, a clapboard building that had not heard a telegraph sounder click since 1934. The platform roof had sagged at both ends. The paint had peeled down to bare wood decades ago. Mice had nested in the freight room. The county had tried to sell it for 15 years, and nobody had wanted it because who wants a dead telegraph station on a dead rail line in a county where the last train ran before most people were born? But Elara Voss wanted it, not because she needed a roof, though she did, not because it was cheap, though it was. She wanted it because her grandmother had taught her to hear a language that almost no one alive still understood, the sharp metallic click of a telegraph sounder turning electricity into words. And what nobody knew, what nobody had known for 90 years, was that hidden beneath the telegraph desk of that old depot was something that would change her life forever. This is that story. She was 22 and homeless. No family left in the county. No savings. No car. Just a canvas rucksack with a brass telegraph key inside it. And $10 she had earned sorting mail at a post office in Decorah. And with that $10, she bought an old railway depot on a forgotten siding in northeast Iowa, a clapboard building that had not heard a telegraph sounder click since 1934. The platform roof had sagged at both ends. The paint had peeled down to bare wood decades ago. Mice had nested in the freight room. The county had tried to sell it for 15 years, and nobody had wanted it, because who wants a dead telegraph station on a dead rail line in a county where the last train ran before most people were born? But Elara Voss wanted it, not because she needed a roof, though she did, not because it was cheap, though it was. She wanted it because her grandmother had taught her to hear a language that almost no one alive still understood, the sharp metallic click of a telegraph sounder turning electricity into words. And what nobody knew, what nobody had known for 90 years, was that hidden beneath the telegraph desk of that old depot was something that would change her life forever. This is that story. Before we go further, if stories like this one mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elara Voss had grown up listening to clicks, not the click of a keyboard, not the click of a light switch, the sharp metallic click of a telegraph sounder. A small electromagnetic instrument about the size of a deck of cards that sat on a wooden base, and that when an electrical signal traveled down a wire and activated the electromagnet inside, produced a single clean click by pulling a metal lever against a metal stop. 2 clicks close together made a dot. 2 clicks farther apart made a dash. And the dots and dashes arranged in patterns were Morse code, the language that had connected every town in America to every other town for 70 years, that had carried train orders and weather reports and death notices and birth announcements and market prices and the news of the world through copper wire strung on wooden poles across the prairies. And that had been the only way to send a message faster than a person could carry it. Her grandmother had taught her to hear that language, the way certain grandmothers in certain railroad towns teach a child the one thing the railroad left behind. By sitting the child beside the sounder and letting her listen until the clicking became words. Her grandmother's name was Margaret Haroldson, and Margaret had not been a hobbyist or a collector or a woman who kept old things because old things were charming. Margaret had been a working telegraph operator, a woman who had sat at the telegraph desk at the Kalmar Depot on the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line in Winneshiek County, Iowa, for 27 years. 27 years of sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day, receiving and sending messages in Morse code at speeds of 20 to 30 words per minute. Translating the clicks of the sounder into words on a message pad. Translating words on a message pad into clicks on the telegraph key. And bearing responsibility for every train order that passed through Kalmar. The instructions that told the engineers when to proceed, when to wait, when to take the siding, and when to hold for an oncoming train. A train order was not a casual message. A train order was a legal instruction. An order from the dispatcher that told an engineer to proceed or to wait. And a train order received incorrectly could put 2 trains on the same track at the same time. The protocol existed to prevent that. The dispatcher sent the order. The operator copied it. The operator repeated it back. The dispatcher confirmed the repeat. 3 transmissions for every order. The redundancy was not bureaucracy. The redundancy was the distance between a normal Tuesday and a catastrophe. Margaret had understood that distance. She had lived inside that distance every working day of her life. To understand Margaret, you had to understand where she came from. And where she came from was a 12-mile stretch of railroad track between Kalmar and Ridgeway, maintained by a man who walked that track every day for 30 years with a spike hammer and a cold chisel. That man was Gunnar Haraldson, Margaret's father, Elara's great-grandfather. Gunnar had come to northeast Iowa from a village near Stavanger, Norway in 1920 because the railroad was hiring section hands. And because the rolling green hills and the deep valleys of the driftless area, that unglaciated stretch of the upper Midwest, where the land had escaped the ice sheets and kept its old shape, its ridges and hollows and limestone bluffs had looked enough like the Norwegian countryside to feel familiar, even though the winters were harder and the language was different. Gunnar had maintained his 12-mile section of track for 30 years. Walking the rails, checking for cracked rail heads and loose spikes and washed-out ballast, replacing ties that had rotted, tamping gravel beneath joints that had settled. The work that kept the trains from derailing and that nobody noticed unless Gunnar failed to do it. He had worked beside the telegraph wire every day of his life. The wire ran along the track on wooden poles, and the poles were part of his section. When a pole rotted, Gunnar replaced it. When a wire sagged, Gunnar tightened it. When an insulator cracked, Gunnar climbed the pole and fitted a new one because the wire was as essential as the rail. Without the wire, The dispatcher in Marquette could not send train orders to the stations, and without train orders, the trains could not move safely on a single-track line where eastbound and westbound trains shared the same rail and depended entirely on the telegraph to tell them where the other train was. The rail carried the train, the wire carried the word, and Gunnar kept both. Margit had been born in 1932 in a small house in Kalmar, the daughter of Gunnar and a woman named Solveig, who had come from the same village near Stavanger and who had died of pneumonia when Margit was 4. Gunnar had raised Margit alone after that in the small house beside the tracks, and the sound of Margit's childhood had been the sound of trains passing and the faint, rhythmic tapping of her father's spike hammer somewhere down the line, and the click of the telegraph sounder in the Kalmar depot. Because every afternoon after school, Margit had walked to the depot and sat on the wooden bench beside the ticket window, waiting for Gunnar to finish his section walk. And while she waited, she had listened to the sounder clicking on the station agent's desk behind the partition through the ticket window. The station agent's name was Mr. Kowalski. He had been at the Kalmar depot from 1928 until his retirement in 1958. 30 years of sitting at the desk, working the key, reading the sounder. Mr. Kowalski was a large man with thick hands and a quiet voice and a patience that seemed to have no bottom, and he had noticed the girl on the bench. He had noticed that she did not fidget, she did not read, she did not look out the window at the platform. She sat and she listened to the sounder, and her eyes tracked the rhythm of the clicks, the way a person's eyes track a speaker's lips when the person is learning a new language. Mr. Kowalski had not said anything to Margit about this for 2 years. He had simply let her sit and listen. And then, one afternoon in 1942, when Margit was 10 years old, Mr. Kowalski had opened the partition door and said, "Do you know what the sounder is saying?" Margit had said, "It said train 42 hold at Ridgeway for eastbound extra." Mr. Kowalski had looked at the girl for a long time. Then he had looked at the message pad on his desk, where he had just transcribed those exact words. Then he had looked back at the girl. "Who taught you the code?" he asked. "Nobody," Margit said. "I just listened." Mr. Kowalski had hired Margit as his assistant in 1950 when she was 18. Not because the railroad required it, but because the railroad needed operators, and because Margit could already copy at 15 words per minute self-taught from 6 years of sitting on a bench and listening through a ticket window. "The sounder speaks," Mr. Kowalski told Margit on her first day behind the desk. "Not in words, in rhythm. Each letter has a rhythm. Each operator has a rhythm. After a year, you will know who is sending by the rhythm alone, without reading the message the way you know a voice on the telephone, without hearing the name. The rhythm is the operator's handwriting. No 2 operators sound the same." Mr. Kowalski had trained Margit across 2 years, teaching her the full operator's discipline. Receiving, listening to the sounder, and transcribing the message onto a pad. Sending, pressing the key to produce clean dots and dashes at a steady speed. And the critical skill of train order protocol, which was the specific sequence of call signs, acknowledgments, and repetitions that ensured a train order was received correctly. "A miscopied train order can kill people," Mr. Kowalski told Margit. "That is not an exaggeration. That is a fact. A single wrong digit in a meat order train, 42 meats train, 37 at Ridgeway instead of Calmer, puts 2 trains on the same track with 3 miles of single rail between them. The sounder does not make mistakes. The operator makes mistakes. Your job is to hear the sounder perfectly every time and to never assume you heard correctly. Copy what you hear. Repeat what you copied. Wait for the confirmation. Then, and only then, do you hand the order to the conductor." Margit had carried that instruction for the rest of her life. She had carried it the way a surgeon carries the knowledge that a misplaced cut can kill. Not as fear, as discipline. She had married a man named Edvard Haraldsson, a distant cousin, a grain elevator operator in Kalmar, who had run the elevator for 20 years, and who came home every evening smelling of wheat dust and diesel, and who had understood that a wife who sat at a telegraph desk all day listening to clicks was a wife whose work was concentration, and that the correct response to a wife who had spent 8 hours concentrating was silence. Edvard had understood silence the way Margit had understood clicks. It was the thing he was good at. He would sit in the kitchen in the evening with a cup of coffee and the Kalmar newspaper and not say a word for an hour, and that hour of silence was the kindest thing he could give her, because in the silence her ears could rest. Edvard had died in 2003. A heart attack at the grain elevator mid-morning, the wheat dust still in the air. He had been 68 years old. They had been married for 41 years, and in those 41 years, Edvard had never once asked Margit to explain what the sounder was saying. He had trusted that what she heard was correct, the same way the engineers on the line had trusted that her train orders were correct, and the trust had been enough. Margit and Edvard had had one daughter. Her name was Ingrid. Ingrid had left Winnesheek County at 19. She had moved to Waterloo 100 miles south and had worked at a meatpacking plant on the east side of the city. She had married a man named Jim Voss, who had worked on a loading dock and who had left Ingrid for a woman in Cedar Rapids when Alara was 5. Ingrid had raised Alara alone in a small apartment in Waterloo on the plant salary. The apartment had smelled of disinfectant and plastic wrapping. The walls were thin and the neighbors were loud, and the sound of Alara's early childhood had been the sound of television through drywall and the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant rumble of a freight train passing through town on the main line. A sound that meant nothing to anyone in Waterloo, but that meant everything to Alara, because it meant the same world her grandmother lived in was somewhere nearby. Alara had spent every summer at Margit's house in Kalmar from the age of 5, and every school break from the age of 7. Because Margit's house did not smell of disinfectant, it smelled of old wood and copper wire and the faint, sharp ozone scent of a telegraph sounder that has been clicking for decades. It smelled like something that mattered. Margaret had kept a working telegraph set on the kitchen table, a key and a sounder wired to a battery, and had used it to teach Ilara the code the same way Mr. Kowalski had taught Margaret. By sound, by rhythm, by the specific muscle memory of hearing a pattern and knowing the letter without thinking. Margaret had taught Ilara to hear the code at 6. She had sat Ilara at the kitchen table beside the sounder and had gone into the next room with the key and pressed single letters. "What did you hear?" Margaret called through the doorway. Ilara listened. Click, click, a short click and a long click. "A," Ilara said. "Dash. That is A," Margaret said. "Now listen again." Click. One short click. A single sharp tap. "E," Ilara said. "That is E1 dot, the shortest letter, the most common letter in English. You will hear E more than any other letter for the rest of your life." By 8, Ilara could copy the entire alphabet at 5 words per minute. Slow, deliberate. Each letter recognized individually, the way a child reading out loud recognizes each word separately before speaking it. By 10, she had reached 10 words per minute, which was the speed at which the letters began to blur into words. The ear no longer hearing individual letters, but hearing patterns of rhythm that the brain recognized as whole words. The way a person reading text does not see individual letters, but sees the shape of the word. By 12, Ilara was copying at 15 words per minute, and Margaret had begun teaching her to send to press the key with her wrist, not her fingers producing clean dots and dashes with consistent spacing. "The key is pressed with the wrist," Margaret told Ilara, sitting beside her at the kitchen table, guiding her hand. "Fingers are too fast and too uneven. The wrist gives you control. The wrist gives you rhythm, and rhythm is everything." By 15, Ilara could copy at 20 words per minute and send at 18. Faster than most hobbyists, slower than a professional operator, but clean and accurate, which mattered more than fast. Margaret had tested her accuracy by sending messages with deliberate errors, a wrong letter, a missing word, and Ilara had caught every error because Margaret had taught her to listen not just for the code, but for the sense. A message that did not make sense contained an error, and an error had to be queried before the message was accepted. "Speed without accuracy is noise," Margaret told Ilara once on a winter afternoon when sleet was hitting the kitchen window and the sounder was clicking between them on the table. "Accuracy without speed is patience. Patience is the better virtue." And then Margit told her about the night of November 14th, 1961. The blizzard had knocked out the telephone lines between Calmar and Marquette. The wind had torn down poles, snapped wires, buried junction boxes under 4 feet of snow. The telephone was dead from Calmar to Cresco, and from Cresco to Marquette, and without the telephone, the dispatcher had no way to communicate with the stations on the line. But the telegraph wire strung higher on the poles above the ice line, thinner and lighter and harder for the wind to catch, had stayed up, and Margaret had been the only communication link between the dispatcher and 6 trains stranded on the line between Calmar and Cresco. She had worked the key for 14 hours straight, receiving and sending train orders, rerouting trains to sidings, coordinating meet points, keeping 6 trains separated on a single track in a blizzard when the visibility was 0 and the rails were buried, and the only thing between those 6 trains and a head-on collision was the click of a telegraph sounder in a small depot in Calmer, Iowa. "The telephone is a convenience," Margaret told Ilara, her eyes steady her voice, the voice of a woman who had been tested and had not failed. "The telegraph is a necessity. The telephone fails in a storm. The telegraph survives. The wire survives because the wire is simple. Copper and electricity and Morse code. Simple things survive." Margate had also taught Ilara about the Morse code itself. Not just the letters, but the structure, the logic, the reason the code was the way it was. Samuel Morse had assigned the shortest patterns to the most common letters. E was a single dot. T was a single dash. Because E and T were the most frequently used letters in English, the longer patterns went to the rarer letters. Q was dash dash dot dash 4 elements because Q was rarely used. The structure was efficient. It minimized transmission time by making common letters fast to send and rare letters slow. "The code is a language designed for speed," Margaret told Ilara. "Every letter is the shortest pattern it can be without being confused with another letter. The code does not waste. Not a single dot is unnecessary." And she had told Ilara about the old depot. 3 miles down the siding from Calmer, on a stretch of abandoned track, where the branch line had once connected to the main line, stood the original Winneshiek Depot, a clapboard building with a waiting room, a freight room, and a telegraph office. The first telegraph station in the county, operated by a man named Stellan Lindqvist from 1889 until his retirement in 1934. Stellan had been the first operator in the county. The depot had been the first building connected to the wire, and the sounder on Stellan's desk had been the first instrument to bring the outside world into Winneshiek County in real time. Stellan Lindqvist could copy at 40 words per minute, Margaret told Ilara on a winter afternoon when they were practicing code at the kitchen table, the snow falling outside and the sounder clicking between them. 40 words per minute. That is hearing and transcribing 40 words in 60 seconds. 2 letters per second. Each letter a different pattern of dots and dashes. Each pattern received and recognized and written on the pad before the next pattern starts. The hand writes what the ear heard 1 second ago, while the ear is already hearing the next letter. The ear is always 1 second ahead of the hand. That lag, that 1 second of trust between hearing and writing, is the operator's skill. You hear it. You trust that you heard it. You write it. You do not go back. You do not second guess. The sounder does not wait. Ilara had listened to these stories the way a person listens to a language they are beginning to understand. Each story was a lesson. Each lesson was a piece of the trade, And the trade was not simply Morse code. The trade was listening. The trade was trust. The trade was the discipline of hearing something correctly and acting on what you heard without hesitation. Because the sounder does not wait, and a train does not wait, and the wire does not care whether you are ready. Margaret had died when Alara was 19, a quiet death at home in Kalmar on a Saturday morning in November 2022. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with the telegraph key and sounder in front of her, the same set she had used to teach Alara, and her hand had been resting on the key, and the sounder had been silent. She had been 90 years old. She had operated the telegraph for 27 years at the Kalmar depot, and she had kept the kitchen set clicking for another 40 years after the depot closed. Because an operator who stops listening forgets the code, and Margaret had not intended to forget. Alara had taken two things from the house: Margaret's telegraph key, a brass J38 hand key with an ebony base, the standard American telegraph key, the lever arm worn smooth by decades of Margaret's wrist, and a framed photograph of Margaret at the Kalmar depot desk in 1967, her hand on the key, the sounder beside her, the train schedule board on the wall behind. In the photograph, Margaret was 35 years old. Her eyes were focused on something beyond the frame, something down the wire, something only she could hear. And her hand on the key was steady and sure, the hand of a woman who had spent 15 years pressing dots and dashes into copper wire, and who had never sent an incorrect train order. After Margaret's death, Ingrid had not wanted Alara back in Waterloo. She had not said this directly. She had said, "There is not much room here." And the way she had said it flat final, the voice of a woman who had made a decision and who did not intend to explain it, had told Alara everything she needed to know about the distance between herself and her mother. Ingrid had left Winnesheek County because she did not want to become Margaret. She did not want to sit at a desk for 27 years listening to clicks. She did not want to live in a small house, in a small town, where the most important thing that happened each day was a train order received correctly. She wanted something else. She did not know what exactly, but she knew it was not clicks. And now her daughter was becoming the thing Ingrid had run from. And Ingrid could not watch it happen again. Alara had gotten a job sorting mail at the post office in Decorah. $12 an hour sorting letters into route bins, standing at a counter in a room that smelled of paper dust and rubber bands. She had rented a room in a shared house on the north side of town. The room had lasted until the landlord's daughter moved home and needed it back. She had $10 in her pocket and no car. She had Margaret's J38 key in her rucksack. She had no plan. She saw the listing at the library. A photocopied notice on the community bulletin board at the Decorah Public Library. Half hidden behind a flyer for a church bake sale. Yellow paper faded ink, the kind of listing that had been pinned to the board so long it had become part of the board. Winnesheek County Surplus. Railway Depot, Old Branch Siding, 3 miles south of Kalmar. $10. Inquire Clerk's Office. $10. the exact amount she had. She walked to the Winnesheek County Clerk's office in Decorah the next morning. The office was in the courthouse, a limestone building on Main Street, with tall windows and the smell of old paper and floor wax. The clerk was a man in his 60s named Mr. Brennan, white hair, reading glasses on a chain. The slow, careful movements of a man who had stamped documents for 30 years and who treated each stamp as though it mattered. Mr. Brennan looked at the $10 bill Elara placed on the counter. He looked at the girl, 22, thin, a canvas rucksack on her back, no car keys in her hand. He pulled a folder from a filing cabinet and opened it on the counter. The old Lindquist depot on the branch siding, Mr. Brennan said. He stamped the deed and slid it across the counter. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a brass key on a loop of copper wire. Stellan Lindquist's granddaughter brought this key to this office in 1975, he said. A woman named Faye Lindquist. She said, "Give it to whoever hears the wire." We never quite understood that. He looked at Elara over his reading glasses. Margaret Haroldson was your grandmother. Yes, sir. Mr. Brennan set the key on the counter beside the deed. Margaret kept the trains running through every blizzard this county has ever had. My father was on the county road crew in '61. He said Margaret saved 6 trains in the storm by working the key all night. He said the wire was the only thing between those trains and a head-on collision. He paused. He said Margaret was the wire. Then Mr. Brennan said something else. He said it quietly, the way a man says something he has been carrying for a while and has been waiting for the right person to say it to. Faye Lindquist is still alive. She lives on the Lindquist farm north of Kalmar. She is 85 years old, and she has been watching that depot for a long time. You should know that she will not be happy to hear someone has moved in. Elara took the key and the deed and walked out of the courthouse into the November wind. She hitched a ride to the branch siding that afternoon with a farmer who was heading north on the county road. The farmer dropped her at the section road turnoff, and she walked the last half-mile along the old rail bed, the grass tall and brown on both sides, the rusted rail half buried beneath her boots. The depot stood at the end of the siding exactly as Margaret had described it, a clapboard building with a hipped roof. A covered platform along the track side with a wooden overhang supported by posts. A freight door on the north end, and a bay window on the south end, the operator's window looking up and down the track in both directions. The siding rail was rusted and half buried in grass. The telegraph poles still stood along the right-of-way leaning crossarms, broken the wire long gone. But the poles were there marking the path the words had traveled. She put the key in the lock. The lock was stiff with years of rust and cold. She pressed and turned, and the mechanism gave with a sound like a bone cracking, and the door swung open. 3 rooms. The waiting room, wooden benches along both walls, a pot-bellied cast-iron stove in the center, a ticket window in the partition wall. The wood was gray with age. Dust lay on every surface like a fine gray cloth. A calendar on the wall read 1934. The freight room, a heavy sliding door on the north wall. A platform scale in the corner, wooden shelving along the east wall, the shelves empty, the scale rusted in place. And the telegraph office, a small room with the bay window, the operator's window, and a heavy oak desk built into the wall beneath the window. A wooden chair. And on the desk, still bolted in place, a telegraph sounder on a wooden base, wired to a terminal block on the wall where the line wire had once entered from the pole outside. The sounder was iron and brass. The electromagnet coils were still wound with fine copper wire. The lever arm was frozen in place by 90 years of stillness, but the mechanism was intact. The spring was intact. The contacts were intact. Elara stood in the doorway of the telegraph office and looked at the desk and the sounder and the bay window and the view up and down the old track bed. And she felt something she had not felt since the last summer at Margot's kitchen table. She felt that she was in a place where listening mattered. The desk had 3 drawers on the right side. She opened the top drawer, empty. The second drawer, a stub of pencil and a dried-out ink bottle. The bottom drawer was deeper than the others. She pulled it. It did not slide. She pulled harder. It moved an inch and stopped. She knelt and looked at the underside of the drawer rail. 2 brass screws hidden beneath the rail holding something in place. Not a drawer. A compartment. Fitted into the desk like a false bottom. She worked the screws free with her fingernail. The brass was green with age, but the threads were clean machined, precisely designed to be opened by someone who knew the screws were there. The compartment dropped open on a hinge. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 objects: a leather instrument case, a heavy canvas pouch, and a thick leather-bound book. She lifted the instrument case first. It was heavy for its size, the leather cracked, but still strong. She unlatched the brass clasps and opened the lid. Inside, nested in a fitted velvet lining that had faded from green to gray, was a matched telegraph set a sending key and a sounder wired together on a polished walnut base. The key was brass with an ebony knob, the lever arm balanced with a counterweight, the contacts clean. The sounder was iron and brass, the electromagnet coils still wound tight, the lever arm and stop adjusted to produce what she already knew. Before she touched it would be a sharp, bright click. The set was stamped on the base plate. 2 letters engraved in the brass. S.L. Stellan Lindqvist. Beside the set, coiled neatly, was a 20-foot length of insulated copper wire and a dry cell battery terminal. Everything needed to make the set operational. She opened the canvas pouch. It was heavy. She poured the contents into her palm, and the weight of them told her what they were before she saw them. Gold coins, 38 of them. Liberty Quarter eagles. She turned them in the gray light from the bay window. The dates ran from 1889 to 1933. 44 years of savings, 1 coin for almost every year, Stellan Lindqvist had sat at this desk. The coin dealer in Decorah would value them later that week at approximately $24,000. She opened the book. It was a message journal, page after page of handwritten entries in a small, precise hand, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life transcribing messages, and who wrote each letter the way he heard each dot and dash, with no wasted motion. The journal recorded selected transmissions across 45 years. Not every message that would have filled 100 volumes, but the important ones. The first train order received at the depot, the last, and every message that had mattered in between. Weather warnings, bridge out reports, troop train dispatches during the First World War, market reports that told the farmers what their grain was worth, death notices that came over the wire before the family had been told, birth announcements sent by proud fathers who walked to the depot in the middle of the night to wire the news. Each entry noted the date, the sending station, the receiving station, the message text in Morse and in English, and a one-line note in Stellan's hand. She turned to an entry near the middle of the journal. November 11th, 1918. Marquette to all stations. Armistice signed stop war over stop. And Stellan's note beneath the sounder was silent for 10 seconds after this message. Then every operator on the line began sending at once, and the wire was full of noise for the first time in my career. And the noise was joy. 45 years of messages. The journal was the voice of the wire. But the last page of the journal, the final entry, was missing, torn out. The ragged edge of the paper was still visible in the binding. Someone had removed the last page carefully, deliberately, long after the ink had dried. Elara stared at the torn edge. Who had taken it? And why? Tucked inside the front cover of the journal was a folded letter. The paper was heavy cream-colored, the kind of paper a man uses when he knows the words he is writing will outlast him. She unfolded it. To whoever opens this desk, my name is Stellan Lindqvist. I have operated this telegraph from 1889 until today, the 14th of September, 1934. I am 67 years old. The telephone has come. The telephone carries the voice, but the telegraph carries the word. A voice fades when the speaking stops. A word on a message pad lasts. I am leaving my instruments and my savings and my journal in this desk, because the desk is where the work was done. The sounder is still wired. Connect the battery. The sounder will click. Stellan Lindqvist, operator. September 14th, 1934. Elara read the letter twice. Then she looked at the telegraph set in the case, the brass key, the iron sounder, the walnut base. And she reached into the case and placed her index finger on the key's brass lever and pressed. The lever moved. The spring tension was still there. 90 years of spring steel holding its calibration. The contact touched and the sounder clicked. One sharp clean click. The sound rang through the telegraph office and into the waiting room and through the empty depot. The first sound the sounder had made since September 14th, 1934. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply listened to the click fade into the silence of the room and understood that the click had been waiting 90 years, and her finger had been the thing the instrument needed to speak again. She said quietly to the desk and the sounder and the bay window looking up and down the track, "Thank you, Mr. Lindqvist. I will hear the wire." She slept on the floor of the telegraph office that night, her rucksack as a pillow, Margaret's photograph propped against the base of the sounder on the desk above her. She could see the photograph in the moonlight through the bay window. Margaret at the Kalmar desk in 1967, hand on the key, and beyond the photograph through the glass, the old track bed running straight into the dark hills and the telegraph poles leaning against the stars. She woke at dawn to the sound of wind against the clapboard walls and a slip of paper flapping against the front door. She walked to the door and pulled the paper free. It was a printed notice. Official, county letterhead. The words were black and sharp against white paper, and they hit her like a fist. Notice of condemnation, Winneshiek County Building Inspector Structure at Old Branch Siding. Parcel 14-227. Found to be in violation of County Safety Code sections 4.2, 4.7, and 4.12. Owner has 60 days to bring structure into compliance, or structure will be demolished. No occupancy permitted until compliance is achieved. 60 days. She had 60 days to save the depot, or they would tear it down. She stood in the doorway holding the notice, the November wind pulling at her hair, and looked out at the old track bed and the rusted rails and the leaning telegraph poles. She had a deed. She had a depot. She had $24,000 in gold coins she had not yet sold. She had a telegraph sounder that had clicked for the first time in 90 years. She had a journal with a missing page. She had a warning from Mr. Brennan about an 85-year-old woman who would not be happy, and she had 60 days. She folded the condemnation notice and put it in her pocket beside the deed and Stellan Lindqvist's letter. Then she walked back to the telegraph desk and pressed the key, and the sounder clicked once in the empty depot, and the click said what the click had always said from the first day Stellan Lindqvist had pressed the key in 1889 to this cold November morning 91 years later. I am here. I am listening. The wire is alive. The first thing Alara did was walk. She walked the entire perimeter of the depot in the gray November morning, her boots crunching on frozen grass, her breath visible in the cold air. She looked at every wall, every joint, every place where wood met wood and where time had done its patient work. The north wall had a section of clapboard where the bottom 3 courses had gone soft with rot. She pressed her thumb into the wood, and it gave like wet paper. The freight door on the north end hung crooked on its track. The upper roller seized, the lower guide bent. The platform roof on the track side had sagged where two support posts had rotted at the base, the posts spongy and dark at ground level where water had pooled against them for decades. The pot-bellied stove in the waiting room had a cracked flue collar. She could see daylight through the gap where the stovepipe met the collar, which meant that any fire lit in the stove would push smoke and carbon monoxide into the room instead of up the chimney. The foundation was limestone hand-laid in 1889, and it was mostly sound. A few stones had shifted where frost had worked beneath them, but the footprint was solid. The roof was cedar shake, and while several shakes had cracked or blown free, the roof deck beneath was still intact. The floor was oak plank, and oak does not rot easily, and most of the planks were still tight and level. She made a list on the back of the condemnation notice. Stovepipe and flue collar, platform posts, north wall clapboard, freight door roller, foundation stones, window glazing 3 panes cracked, 2 missing entirely. She looked at the list. She looked at the depot. She did not know how to do any of these things. She had never replaced a stovepipe. She had never set a post. She had never cut clapboard or hung a door or reglazed a window. But she had learned Morse code at 5 words per minute when she was 8 years old, and she had learned it by sitting at a table and listening until the clicks became letters and the letters became words. She had learned by doing the thing until the thing was learned. And she did not see any reason why a stovepipe should be different from a telegraph key. She hitched a ride to Decorah that morning and sold the gold coins to a dealer on Water Street. The dealer was a quiet man in a small shop who looked at the coins through a loupe and set them in rows on a velvet pad and told her they were worth approximately $24,000. She deposited the check at the bank on Water Street and opened a checking account and walked out into the November wind with more money than she had ever had in her life. She bought a used truck the following week. A 2000 Chevy S10 with 181,000 miles and Iowa mud on the fenders from a retired farmer in Calmer for $1,600. The truck smelled of hay and engine oil and the specific dusty sweetness of a vehicle that has spent its life on gravel roads, and the engine started on the first turn every time, which was the only thing that mattered. She bought stovepipe from the hardware store in Decorah for $35 and 2 treated posts from the lumber yard for $20 and a box of galvanized nails and a claw hammer and a handsaw and a level and a square. The man at the lumber yard looked at her purchases and said, "Building something, fixing something," Elara said. The stovepipe was the first job. She spent an entire day on it. She removed the cracked flue collar with a wrench she had borrowed from Mr. Brennan, and the old collar came apart in her hands like rust and memory. She fitted the new collar, seated it on the stove's flue outlet, and sealed the joint with stove cement. She fitted 3 sections of new pipe from the collar to the chimney thimble, securing each joint with sheet metal screws. She made mistakes. The first section of pipe was too long. She had to take it down and cut it with the hacksaw, and the hacksaw slipped, and she cut her palm, and she wrapped her hand in a strip of cloth torn from an old sheet she had found in the freight room, and she finished the cut and fitted the pipe, and it was right. The second section she measured twice before cutting, and it was right the first time, and she understood that the lesson of the stovepipe was the same lesson Margit had taught her about the telegraph. Measure twice. Cut once. Accuracy before speed. Patience is the better virtue. She lit the first fire on a Thursday evening in late November. Dry oak splits from a dead fall along the old track bed. The wood caught and the flames climbed, and the stovepipe drew clean and true, and the warmth spread from the waiting room through the open doorway into the telegraph office, and the old wood warmed, and the depot smelled of creosote and iron, and the faint ozone scent of old copper wire. She lay on the folding army cot she had bought at the thrift store in Decorah for $10, set up in the telegraph office beneath the bay window, and she watched the firelight play across the telegraph desk, and the sounder bolted to its surface. And for the first time since Margit's death, the world felt like it had a shape she recognized. Mr. Brennan drove out to the siding on a Saturday morning with a jack and a level in the bed of his truck. He did not ask if she needed help. He simply arrived, and he and Alara spent 4 hours lifting the sagging platform roof, with the jack pulling the rotted posts free, setting the new treated posts in gravel, tamping the gravel with the flat end of a digging bar, and lowering the roof onto the new supports. Mr. Brennan worked slowly and carefully, checking the level after every adjustment the way a man works when he believes that work done correctly is its own reward. He did not talk much. When he did talk, he talked about Stellan Lindqvist. "Stellan operated this telegraph for 45 years, Mr. Brennan said, tapping gravel around the post base with the flat of his hand. "My grandfather said Stellan could hear a message in his sleep. He said Stellan once received a bridge-out warning at 3 in the morning and stopped a freight train 2 miles from a washed-out crossing. The engineer said if the wire had been down, he would have gone into the river." Mr. Brennan straightened up and looked at the depot and the bay window and the old track bed running into the hills. 45 years, he said. A man sits in a room for 45 years and listens to a piece of iron click. And because he listens, people live. And when he is gone, nobody remembers his name except the people who live in the county where he worked. He looked at Alara. Your grandmother was the same. 27 years. Nobody outside this county knows her name. But everyone in this county over the age of 50 knows what she did in the storm of 61. A woman named Mrs. Dahl, who farmed the land beside the siding, drove down the section road the following Saturday with a box of supplies in the bed of her truck. A coffee pot, 2 enamel mugs, a skillet, a sack of oats, a jar of apple butter, and a knitted wool blanket thick and heavy, the kind of blanket a woman knits over a winter when her hands need something to do. Your grandmother sent my mother a telegraph on the day I was born, Mrs. Dahl said, setting the box on the waiting room bench. 1959. My father walked to the Kalmar depot at 4 in the morning and dictated the message, and Margit sent it to my mother's sister in Marquette. My aunt received it before sunrise. The message said, "Girl, stop healthy, stop beautiful, stop." 3 words and 3 stops. That is how my aunt learned I existed. Mrs. Dahl came back every Sunday after that. She brought eggs and bread and sometimes a jar of soup, and she sat in the waiting room by the stove and drank coffee from one of the enamel mugs and told Ilara stories about the old days on the siding when the trains still ran and the telegraph poles still carried wire, and the depot was a place where people came to send the most important messages of their lives. 3 weeks into the repairs on a Tuesday morning when the temperature was 14 degrees and the frost on the bay window was thick enough to scratch with a fingernail, Ilara heard a truck on the section road. She looked through the window. An old Ford F-25, dark blue rust along the wheel wells, pulling slowly down the gravel road and stopping beside the platform. The engine shut off. A man got out. He was tall and thin and old. 72, maybe older. White hair under a seed cap. A canvas work jacket, the kind that has been washed so many times, the fabric has gone soft. Heavy boots, laced tight. He stood beside the truck and looked at the depot the way a man looks at a place he has not seen in a long time but has not forgotten. He walked to the platform and looked at the new posts Ilara and Mr. Brennan had set. He looked at the stovepipe clean and straight against the roof. He looked at the north wall where Ilara had begun pulling the rotted clapboard free, the bare studs exposed to the air like ribs. Then he looked at Ilara, who was standing in the freight room doorway with a claw hammer in one hand and a rotted board in the other. He did not introduce himself. He said, "Your sill plate is gone on that north wall. You pull the clapboard, but you do not replace the sill. The new boards will rot in 3 years." Ilara looked at the exposed wall. She did not know what a sill plate was. The man walked to his truck and took a jack and a pry bar from the bed. He walked to the north wall and knelt and looked at the base of the studs where they met the foundation. He pressed the pry bar against the wood at the base, and the wood crumbled. "Sill plate," he said. "The horizontal timber between the foundation and the studs. Yours has rotted through. Water wicks up from the limestone into the sill, and the sill rots, and everything above it follows." He stood up. "You need a new sill, pressure treated, 4x6. I have one in my barn that I cut for a project I never started." He looked at her. His eyes were pale blue and steady, the eyes of a man who has spent his life looking down a track that runs straight to the horizon. "I will bring it Saturday," he said. "My name is Walt Egan." He got in the truck and drove away. Walt Egan came back on Saturday with the sill timber in the bed of his truck, a 12-foot length of pressure-treated 4x6, dense and heavy smelling of the chemical preservative that would keep it from rotting for 30 years. He also brought a bottle jack, a come-along 6 concrete shims, and a thermos of coffee. He and Ilara worked for 7 hours. They jacked the north wall up an inch at a time, Walt watching the studs for signs of splitting, Ilara operating the jack with slow, steady pumps. They pulled the rotted sill out in pieces. It came apart like dark bread, the wood fibers so degraded they had no structure left. They shimmed the foundation where the limestone had settled. They slid the new sill timber into place, lowered the wall onto it, and checked the level. Walt worked the way certain men of his generation work, without hurry, without wasted motion, with a patience that came not from having nothing to do, but from having done enough to know that speed was the enemy of precision. He did not explain what he was doing unless Elara asked. When she asked, he answered in short, specific sentences that contained exactly the information needed and nothing more. White oak for the sill, not red. White oak resists water. Red oak drinks it. Set the shims on the high side of the stone. Gravity will hold them. Do not force the timber. If it does not slide, the foundation is not level. Level the foundation first. At the end of the 7 hours, they sat on the platform in the fading light, drinking the last of the coffee from the thermos. The north wall was solid. The new sill was in place. The studs were sitting on treated wood instead of wrought, and the wall would stand for another 50 years. Walt looked at the depot. He looked at the bay window of the telegraph office and the sounder visible on the desk inside. He drank his coffee. Then he said quietly, the way he said everything, I drove trains on this line for 35 years. Milwaukee Road, diesel freight, Kalmar to Marquette and back. He paused. I drove past this depot 1,000 times. The depot was closed by then, but the poles were still standing. And every time I passed, I looked at the bay window, and I thought about the man who used to sit behind that window and listen to the sounder and copy the train orders that told me whether I lived or died on any given run. He set the coffee cup on the platform beside him. I was an engineer. I depended on the operator. If the operator heard wrong, I died. Every time I received a train order, I put my life in the hands of the person sitting behind that desk, and I never met that person. I never knew their name. I just trusted that they heard the sounder correctly. He looked at Elara. Your grandmother was one of those people. I did not know that until Brennan told me. I ran trains through Kalmar for 20 years, and I never knew the name of the operator who kept me alive. Elara said, her name was Margit. I know that now, Walt said. He came back every Saturday after that. He did not ask if he was welcome. He simply arrived with tools and materials and the thermos, and he and Elara worked on whatever needed to be done. The freight door, the window glazing, the foundation stones, the clapboard on the north wall. Walt did not give speeches. Walt did not tell her what the depot meant, or what the telegraph meant, or what her grandmother's work had meant. Walt replaced sill plates and hung doors and set window glass. And the work he did was the statement he made, and the statement was this. A man who had driven trains for 35 years believed that the place where the operator sat was worth saving. 5 weeks after the condemnation notice on a cold December afternoon, A black SUV pulled down the section road and parked beside the platform. A man got out. He was 55, well-dressed for the county, a wool overcoat, polished boots, a leather portfolio under his arm. His name was Colton Mercer. Mercer was a real estate developer from Des Moines who had been buying land in Winneshiek County for 3 years. Small parcels, farmland, old homesteads. He had a vision for the area rural tourism heritage lodges, weekend retreats for people from the cities who wanted to experience the countryside without actually living in it. The depot sat on a piece of land that was central to Mercer's plan. 2 acres on the old siding, bordered by County Road to the south, and Dahl farmland to the north, with a view of the rolling hills and the old rail bed that Mercer's marketing materials described as the authentic Heartland Corridor. Mercer walked the platform slowly, looking at the depot the way a man looks at a building he has already mentally demolished. He knocked on the door. Elara opened it. "Miss Voss," Mercer said. He had learned her name. He had done his research. "I am Colton Mercer. I own most of the land surrounding this parcel, and I would like to talk to you about the depot." He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped inside and looked around the waiting room, the pot-bellied stove radiating heat, the wooden benches, the new stovepipe, the work in progress. He nodded the way a man nods when he is calculating value. "You have done good work here," Mercer said. "But this building is 136 years old, and the county has condemned it, and the repairs you are making, while admirable, will not bring it up to code. The wiring is non-existent. The plumbing is non-existent. The foundation needs repointing. You are looking at $60,000 to $80,000 in structural work alone, and that is before you address habitability standards." He set his portfolio on the bench and opened it. "I am prepared to offer you $40,000 for the property, the land and the structure. That is 4,000 times what you paid for it. You could rent an apartment in Decorah. You could go to community college. You could start a life that does not involve living in a condemned building in the middle of a field." He said this without cruelty. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes to be true and generous. Elara looked at him. She looked at the portfolio on the bench. She looked at the telegraph office through the open doorway, the desk, the sounder, the bay window, Margaret's photograph on the desk. "No," she said. Mercer closed the portfolio. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He looked at her with something that was not anger, but was close to pity, and he said, "Nostalgia does not keep you warm, Miss Voss, and it does not fix a foundation." He walked out and drove away. That evening, Elara sat at the telegraph desk and looked at the condemnation notice and Mercer's card, which he had left on the bench, and she understood something she had not understood before. Mercer was not wrong. The depot needed more than she could give it. The money from the coins was disappearing into materials and hardware, and the list of repairs was longer than the list of days she had left before the county inspector returned. And Mercer was the one who had pushed the inspection. She was certain of that now. The timing was too precise. The condemnation notice had appeared the morning after she moved in, which meant someone had called the county building inspector and asked for an emergency assessment, and the only person who had reason to do that was the person who wanted the land. She pressed the key on Stellan's set, and the sounder clicked, and the click steadied her the way it always did. One clean sound in a complicated world. 2 days later, Faye Lindqvist came to the depot. She arrived without warning in an old Buick sedan driving slowly down the section road, the way a person drives when they know exactly where they are going, but are not sure they want to arrive. She parked beside the platform and sat in the car for a full minute before she opened the door. She was 85 years old. Small, thin, white hair pulled back from a face that was sharp with age and sharper with something else. A grievance held so long it had become architecture. She wore a heavy coat and thick-soled shoes, and she walked with the careful precision of a woman who did not intend to fall. She did not knock. She pushed the depot door open and stood in the waiting room and looked at Ilara, and her eyes went from Ilara to the stove, to the telegraph office doorway, to the desk visible beyond. And when her eyes reached the desk and the sounder bolted to its surface, she stopped. "That is my grandfather's sounder," Faye said. "Yes, ma'am." "You opened the desk." "I did." Faye walked to the telegraph office doorway and stood there, looking at the desk. The sounder, the 2 keys side by side, Margit's photograph, the message journal hanging open on the wall above. "The journal," Faye said. Her voice changed. It lost its edge. It became the voice of a woman who was looking at something she had tried to forget and could not. "You found the journal." "I did, and the letter, and the coins, and the telegraph set." Faye was silent for a long time. She stood in the doorway and looked at the journal, and Ilara could see her hands trembling, not with age, but with something older than age. "The last page is missing," Ilara said quietly. Faye closed her eyes. "I tore it out," Faye said. 40 years ago. I came into this depot with the key before I gave the key to the clerk's office, and I opened the desk, and I read the journal, and I tore out the last page. "Why?" Faye opened her eyes. They were wet. "Because my grandfather chose this depot over his family. He sat in this room for 45 years, and he listened to that sounder, and he wrote in that journal, and he saved his gold coins, and he left everything here in this desk instead of leaving it to us, his children, his grandchildren. He left it for a stranger, for whoever hears the wire. That is what the key said. Give it to whoever hears the wire. Not give it to my family. Not give it to the people who carry my name. Give it to a stranger who understands a dead language." She looked at Ilara. "I was 35 years old, and I was angry. I thought he had abandoned us for a machine. So I tore out the last page because I did not want anyone to read what he wrote. I wanted to erase the last thing he ever said. "What was on the page?" Elara asked. Faye shook her head slowly. "I do not remember. I tore it and I burned it, and I brought the key to the clerk's office and I said, 'Give it to whoever hears the wire,' because those were his words, and I did not have the right to change them even though I wanted to. And then I went home and I tried to forget this place." She paused. "I did not succeed." Faye sat on the wooden chair in the telegraph office beneath the bay window, and Elara made coffee on the pot-bellied stove and brought it to her in one of Mrs. Dahl's enamel mugs, and they sat together in the small room where Stellan Lindqvist had listened to the wire for 45 years. Faye told Elara one more thing before she left. She said it standing at the door, her hand on the frame, looking back at the telegraph desk. "Your mother called me, Ingrid. She called last week. She asked about the gold coins. She wanted to know if there was more." Then Faye walked to her car and drove away. Elara stood in the doorway and watched the Buick disappear down the section road, and she felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the December air. Ingrid arrived 3 days later. She came in a rental car, a white sedan that looked wrong on the gravel section road, too clean, too smooth, a city car on a country road. She parked beside the platform and got out and stood looking at the depot, the way she had looked at everything in Winnesheek County since the day she left, with the expression of a woman who saw what she had escaped rather than what she had lost. Ingrid was 51. She had Margit's jawline, but not Margit's steadiness. Her eyes moved constantly from the depot to the truck, to the platform, to the stovepipe, to the bay window, the way a person's eyes move when they are calculating. Not calculating value the way Mercer calculated. Calculating risk. She did not hug Elara. She did not ask how Elara was doing. She walked into the waiting room and sat on the bench beside the stove and said, "This is what you are doing with your life." It was not a question. It was a verdict. Elara stood by the stove and looked at her mother and said nothing. "Your grandmother sat in a room like this for 27 years, Ingrid said. She sat at a desk and she listened to clicks, and she wrote on a pad, and she went home to a silent husband, and she did that for 27 years. And when the depot closed, she kept the telegraph on the kitchen table, and she clicked at it for another 40 years alone in a house that smelled of copper wire. And now you are doing the same thing. You are 22 years old, and you are living in a condemned building, listening to a machine that has not been connected to anything since 1934. Elara looked at her mother's face. She saw the tightness around the eyes, the set of the jaw, the way Ingrid's hands gripped her knees, and she understood that her mother was not angry. Her mother was afraid. "I did not come for the money," Ingrid said, and her voice dropped low, and the fear was in it now undisguised, the voice of a woman who had watched her own mother disappear into silence, and who was watching her daughter walk the same path. "I came because I have seen this before. I watched your grandmother choose the wire over everything, over her daughter, over her life. She loved that sounder more than she loved me. I know that. I have always known that. And I left because I could not live in a house where a machine was more important than a person. She looked at the telegraph office doorway, at the desk, at Margit's photograph on the desk. You are becoming her, Ingrid said. You are 22 years old, and you are becoming a woman who sits alone in a room and listens to clicks. And I cannot watch it happen twice. The silence between them was the kind of silence that holds 30 years of distance in it. 30 years of phone calls not made, and visits not taken, and words not said compressed into the space between a mother and a daughter standing in a room heated by a cast-iron stove. Elara said, I am not choosing to be alone. I am choosing to listen. Ingrid looked at her. Then Ingrid looked at the floor, and her grip on her knees loosened, and for a moment she looked like what she was, a woman who had run from something and had been running for 30 years, and who was tired. Your grandmother said the same thing, Ingrid said quietly. The night I told her I was leaving, she said, I am not choosing the wire over you. I am choosing to listen. And I said, you are listening to a machine, not to me. And she did not answer. And I left. Ingrid stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. There is no more money, Elara said. The coins are gone. I spent them on the truck and the repairs. Ingrid nodded. She did not turn around. I did not come for the money, she said again, and this time Elara heard something in her mother's voice she had not heard before. Not anger, not fear, but something close to grief. The grief of a woman who understood that she had lost her mother to the wire and was now losing her daughter to the same wire, and that the wire was not a machine at all, but a choice, a way of being in the world, and that the choice was not hers to make or to unmake. Ingrid walked to the rental car. She sat in the driver's seat and did not start the engine. She sat there for a long time looking at the depot through the windshield. Then she started the car and drove away down the section road. Elara stood in the doorway and watched the white car disappear. She did not cry. She pressed her hand against the door frame, and the wood was cold and rough and real, and she stood there until the sound of the engine faded, and there was nothing left but the wind and the depot and the faint ticking of the pot-bellied stove. That night, she could not sleep. She lay on the cot in the telegraph office and listened to the wind against the clapboard walls and thought about what her mother had said. You are becoming her. And she thought about Margit sitting at the kitchen table at 90 years old, hand on the key sounder, silent, alone. The word sat in the dark like a stone. She got up and lit the oil lamp on the desk and opened the message journal. She had been reading it slowly a few pages each night, moving through Stellan Lindqvist's 45 years of messages, the way a person moves through a history book that is also a diary. She turned to a page near the end, an entry she had not read before. March 3rd, 1929, Des Moines to all stations. Grain markets collapse. Stop wheat at historic low stop. Stellan's note. I sent this message to every farmer in the county by way of their wives who came to the depot to hear the prices. Mrs. Erickson was in the waiting room when I copied the message. She did not speak. She stood and walked out, and I watched her walk down the road toward her farm, and I understood that the message I had just received was the death of a way of life. She turned more pages, entry after entry. The voice of a man who had sat in this room and heard the world pass through copper wire, and who had understood that the messages he received were not just words. They were the lives of the people who sent them and the people who received them, compressed into dots and dashes and handed to a stranger at a desk who bore the responsibility of hearing them correctly. And then she found it. A note, not a message entry. Written in Stellan's hand in the margin of a page dated August 1933. Second box beneath the freight room floor, east wall, third plank from the door. For the day, the desk is not enough. Ilara read the note 3 times. She got up from the cot and carried the oil lamp into the freight room. She knelt on the oak plank floor and counted. East wall, third plank from the door. She pried the plank up with the claw hammer, working the nails free one at a time. The old iron nails coming up with a sound like small bones breaking. The plank came free. She lifted it aside and held the lamp over the gap. Beneath the floor, sitting on the limestone foundation, was a tin box. Soldered shut, the solder bright, even after 90 years, sealed against moisture and time, and whatever else Stellan Lindqvist had wanted to keep out. She reached down and lifted the box. It was heavy, not coin heavy, paper heavy. She carried it to the telegraph desk and set it beneath the lamp and looked at it. A tin box, 12 inches by 8 inches by 4 inches, soldered shut with a bead of lead solder around the lid. On the top, scratched into the tin with a sharp instrument, a telegraph key, perhaps the pointed end of the lever arm, were 2 words. The wire. She looked at the box. She looked at the sounder on the desk. She looked at Margit's photograph. She did not open it that night. She set the box on the desk beside the sounder and lay back on the cot and looked at the bay window and the stars beyond and the telegraph poles leaning against the dark sky. Whatever was in the box had waited 90 years. It could wait until morning. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind and the ticking stove and the silence of the sounder. And she slept. And in the morning, the light came through the bay window and fell across the desk, and the sounder, and the tin box, and the day of opening had come. She opened the box at dawn. The solder gave way under the blade of a flathead screwdriver Walt had left in the freight room, the soft lead splitting along the seam with a faint metallic whisper. the sound of a seal broken after 90 years of silence. She worked the blade around the entire lid, slow and careful, the way Margit had taught her to work accuracy before speed. And when the last inch of solder parted, she lifted the lid and set it on the desk beside the sounder. Inside the box, wrapped in waxed linen, were 2 items. The first was a document, heavy paper, the kind used for legal instruments in the 19th century, thick cream-colored with a watermark she could see when she held it to the light from the bay window. She unfolded it and read. It was a deed of grant, dated June 3rd, 1889, issued by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway Company. It conveyed in the dense, formal language of 19th century property law the following: the railway depot structure and the surrounding parcel of land comprising 2 acres described by metes and bounds along the old branch siding to Stellan Lindqvist, telegraph operator, and to his successors in the operation of the telegraph station in perpetuity, as consideration for services rendered in the establishment and maintenance of the telegraph line. In perpetuity, to the operator and his successors. The land had never belonged to the county. The county had listed it as surplus because the tax records showed no owner after Stellan's death, and the railroad company had dissolved decades ago, and no one had ever searched the property chain far enough to find the original grant. The county had assumed the land was abandoned. The county had been wrong. The deed meant the condemnation notice had no legal basis. The county could not condemn a structure on land it did not own and had never owned. The 60-day deadline was meaningless. The threat of demolition was empty. And Colton Mercer's offer to buy the property for $40,000 was an offer to buy something the county had no right to sell and that Mercer had no standing to purchase. Elara set the deed on the desk and looked at it in the morning light. 2 acres and a depot granted to an operator and his successors. She was the successor, not by blood, not by inheritance, by the fact that she could hear the wire. She picked up the second item from the box. It was a single page of paper, the same heavy stock as the deed, but covered in handwriting. Stellan Lindqvist's small, precise hand, the same hand that filled the message journal, the hand of a man who wrote each letter the way he heard each dot and dash. The page was dated September 14th, 1934, the same date as the letter she had found in the desk compartment. The same day Stellan had closed the depot. This was the missing page from the journal. The last entry. The page Faye Lindqvist believed she had torn out and burned 40 years ago. Elara understood it now. Stellan had anticipated this. He had known that someone, a family member, a stranger, a county clerk, might find the journal before the right person found the desk. He had placed a loose page at the back of the journal, a decoy easy to remove. The real last page, the one that mattered, he had sealed in the tin box beneath the freight room floor, with the deed that proved ownership. The page that Faye had torn out and burned had been a copy. The words Faye could not remember were the words she had never truly read, because the page she read was not the page Stellan intended for the person who heard the wire. This was the real page, the last thing Stellan Lindqvist ever wrote at this desk. Elara held it in the lamplight and read, September 14th, 1934. Final entry. I closed the station today. The telephone has come to every farm and every house in the county, and the railroad has discontinued telegraph service on this line. The wire outside my window is dead. No current runs through it. No signals pass. The sounder on my desk is silent for the first time in 45 years. I have operated this telegraph since June 3rd, 1889. I was 22 years old when I sat at this desk for the first time and received the first message ever transmitted to this station. The message came from Marquette. It said, "Test, stop. Can you hear me? Stop." And I pressed the key and sent, "Yes, stop. I hear you, stop. The wire is alive." I have thought about those words often. The wire is alive. I said them without thinking, the way a young man says a thing that is true without knowing how true it will become. The wire was alive. For 45 years, the wire carried the words of this county to the world, and the words of the world to this county. Every train order, every weather warning, every birth and death, every price and every prayer. The wire carried all of it, and I sat at this desk and listened, and listening was my work and my purpose and the thing I was placed on this earth to do. Today I sent one last message. I connected the battery and I pressed the key and I sent into the dead wire, knowing no one would receive it, knowing the message would travel a few hundred feet along the copper and then stop because there was no one listening at the other end. I sent it anyway. Because an operator sends. That is what an operator does. The message was this. To anyone who hears this, wire stop. I have listened for 45 years. Stop. The wire does not carry messages. Stop. The wire carries trust. Stop. Every train order is a promise that someone is listening. Stop. Do not let the wire die. Stop. Connect it to the next person. Stop. I leave my instruments and my savings and my journal and this deed in the desk and beneath the floor, because the desk is where the work was done and the floor is the foundation the work stood on. The deed grants this station to the operator and his successors. You who read this are my successor, not because you carry my name, because you hear the wire. The wire does not die if someone is listening. Stellan Lindqvist, operator. Below the signature in smaller handwriting, a final line added. It seemed as an afterthought, the way a man adds the truest thing last, because the truest thing is the hardest to write. To the girl who sits in the waiting room every afternoon and listens to the sounder through the ticket window, I hear you listening. That is enough. That is everything. Elara set the page down on the desk. The girl in the waiting room. In 1934, when Stellan closed the depot, the Kalmar depot was still operating. Mr. Kowalski was the agent there, and Margit, 2 years old in 1934, had not yet begun sitting on the bench in the Kalmar waiting room. That would come later, when she was 5 or 6, but Stellan had not written the date on this final line. It was in different ink, darker, newer. He had added it later, perhaps years later. Perhaps he had visited the Kalmar depot after his retirement and had seen a small girl sitting on the bench, listening to the sounder through the ticket window. Perhaps he had recognized in her what he recognized in himself, the ability to hear the wire not as noise, but as language. Perhaps he had gone home to his farm and taken the tin box from wherever he kept it and opened it and added one last line to the page before sealing the box and burying it beneath the freight room floor. The girl was Margit. Stellan had seen Margit listening, and he had written to her across the years, across the decades, knowing that the message would not reach her directly, but trusting that the wire, the chain of listeners, operator to operator, grandmother to granddaughter, would carry it eventually. And it had. It had taken 90 years. But the wire had carried it. Elara sat at the desk for a long time. The morning light moved across the floor. The stove ticked in the waiting room. The sounder sat on the desk, silent, waiting the way it had waited for 90 years. She pressed the key. The sounder clicked. She pressed again, dot dash, dot dot, dot dot dash dot. A-L-I-E. She spelled the word into the empty room, into the still air, into the copper coils of the electromagnet that Stellan Lindqvist had wound by hand in 1889. The wire is alive. She drove to Decorah that afternoon and met with the lawyer. Mr. Brennan had recommended a woman named Catherine Holst, who had a small office above the hardware store and who specialized in property law. Elara showed her the deed of grant. Catherine Holst read the deed twice, holding it under a desk lamp, examining the seal and the signatures and the legal description of the parcel. She set it down and looked at Elara. "This is valid," Catherine said. "The grant is in perpetuity. The railroad conveyed the property to the operator and his successors. The county never held title. The surplus listing was an error. The county assumed abandonment because the tax records showed no living owner. But the deed predates the county tax system for this parcel. The property was never taxable because it was granted as consideration for services not purchased." She paused. "The condemnation notice is unenforceable. The county cannot condemn a structure on land it does not own. And any party seeking to acquire this property would need to establish a claim superior to the original grant, which, given the language of the deed, would be extremely difficult." "What about Mr. Mercer?" Elara asked. "Mr. Mercer can make offers all day, but he cannot buy what the county does not own, and the county does not own this land. You do, or rather, the operator does, and you are the operator." Elara drove back to the depot with the deed in a manila envelope on the passenger seat of the S10. She parked beside the platform and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the depot in the December light. The new posts, the straight stovepipe, the solid north wall, the bay window catching the low winter sun. She went inside and called Mr. Brennan from the depot's only modern addition, a prepaid cell phone she had bought at the gas station in Kalmar. She told him about the deed. Mr. Brennan was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I will inform the building inspector, and I will inform Mr. Mercer." The next day, Colton Mercer drove down the section road for the second time. He parked and sat in his SUV for several minutes before getting out. When he came to the door, his expression was different from the first visit. The calculation was gone. In its place was something more complicated, the expression of a man who had lost and who was deciding what kind of man he would be in the losing. "Miss Voss," he said, "I have seen the deed." "Yes. My lawyer confirms it is valid." "Yes." Mercer looked at the depot. He looked at the platform, the new posts, the repaired wall. He looked at the bay window and the sounder visible on the desk inside. "I am not going to pretend I am happy about this," Mercer said. "I had plans for this land, good plans, plans that would have brought jobs and revenue to this county." He paused. "But I did not have the right to this land. I thought I did, and I was wrong. And I pushed the county to condemn the building because I wanted you out, and that was wrong too." He stood on the platform and looked at the hills and the old track bed and the leaning telegraph poles. "I have a proposal," Mercer said. "Not for the land, for the building. I will fund the remaining repairs foundation, repointing electrical service, plumbing, insulation, whatever the county requires for habitability on one condition. You open the depot to the public 1 day a month. Let people see it. Let them hear the sounder. Let them understand what this place was." Elara looked at him. She thought about Stellan, who had sat at this desk for 45 years and listened for a county that did not know his name. She thought about Margit, who had worked the key for 27 years and saved 6 trains in a blizzard and gone home every night to a silent husband and a small house and had never asked for recognition. "1 Saturday a month," Elara said. "I will demonstrate the telegraph. I will let people listen to the sounder, but the depot stays as it is. No signs, no gift shop, no heritage corridor." Mercer almost smiled. "No heritage corridor," he said. He extended his hand. Elara shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who had learned something he had not expected to learn. Faye Lindqvist came to the depot for the second time on a Sunday morning in January, after Elara had called her and asked her to come. Elara handed her the page, the real last page, the one Stellan had sealed in the tin box. Faye read it, standing in the telegraph office beside the bay window, in the light that fell across the desk where her grandfather had worked for 45 years. She read it slowly. And when she reached the last line, to the girl who sits in the waiting room every afternoon and listens to the sounder through the ticket window, "I hear you listening," that is enough. That is everything. She stopped reading and pressed the page against her chest and closed her eyes. She stood that way for a long time. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the clapboard walls. The depot held its silence around her like a hand. "I thought he chose this place over us." Faye said, her eyes still closed. I thought the depot was more important to him than his family. I was wrong. He did not choose the depot over his family. He chose to listen. And listening was not a rejection of us. Listening was his gift to everyone, to the county, to the trains, to the farmers, to the girl on the bench. She opened her eyes and looked at Elara. I have something for you, Faye said. She went to her car and came back with a small cardboard box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a framed photograph. Black and white, slightly faded, the edges soft with age. Stellan Lindqvist at the telegraph desk. 1920, maybe 1925. His hand on the key. The sounder beside him. The bay window behind, bright with daylight, the track visible through the glass. He was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of a sentence, and who is waiting patiently for the interruption to end so he can finish what he was saying. Elara hung the photograph on the wall beside Margit's photograph. Stellan at the desk in 1920. Margit at the desk in 1967. Two operators, two desks, the same wire, the same language, the same work. Faye looked at the two photographs side by side and nodded once, the nod of a woman who had carried a weight for 40 years and had finally set it down. In February, Mr. Tierney, the curator of the Railway Heritage Museum in Marquette, drove to the depot. He had heard from Mr. Brennan about the Lindqvist telegraph set, and he had heard from Mrs. Dahl about the young woman who could send and receive Morse code at 20 words per minute. Mr. Tierney was a careful man, a man who had spent 30 years collecting telegraph equipment and railway artifacts, and who approached every new piece with the skepticism of a person who has seen too many reproductions sold as originals. He sat at the desk, and Elara went into the waiting room with Margit's J38 key, which she had wired to Stellan's sounder through a length of copper wire and a battery. She sat on the bench beside the stove and pressed the key. Mr. Tierney listened. He had a pad and pencil on the desk, and he transcribed the message as the sounder clicked slowly at first. Then, with increasing confidence, because Mr. Tierney had learned Morse code 40 years ago and had never quite lost it, the way a person never quite loses a language learned in youth. When the clicking stopped, Mr. Tierney looked at the pad. He had written 5 words. The wire is alive. Stop. He read the words aloud. His voice was quiet, and there was something in it, not surprise, but recognition. The sound of a man hearing something he had been waiting 30 years to hear. I have been collecting telegraph equipment for 30 years, Mr. Tierney said when Elara came back into the telegraph office. I have 40 sounders in my museum. Some of them are from famous stations. Some of them are worth thousands of dollars. And I have never heard a sounder with a click that clean. The spring tension is perfect. The gap is perfect. The tone is perfect. Stellan Lindqvist adjusted the spring 90 years ago, Elara said. I have not touched it. Then Stellan was a better technician than any of us, Mr. Tierney said. He offered her a job. 2 days a week at the museum in Marquette, demonstrating the telegraph for visitors, sending and receiving messages in Morse code, explaining the instrument, letting people hear the sounder click, and understanding what it meant to hear the world arrive through copper wire 1 dot and 1 dash at a time. She took the job. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Spring came to the siding, the way spring comes to northeast Iowa, slowly, reluctantly, the frost giving up the ground an inch at a time. The brown grass greening from the roots, the creek behind the depot breaking its ice with a sound like glass cracking. Mercer's contractor arrived in March. A quiet crew of 3 men who spoke little and worked steadily repointing the limestone foundation, running electrical service from a pole on the county road, installing a water line and a small bathroom in what had been a storage closet off the freight room. They worked around the depot's original features, drilling through no original wood-running conduit along baseboards instead of through walls. Mercer had given them one instruction: change nothing that Stellan Lindqvist built. In April, a postcard arrived at the depot. No return address. Waterloo postmark. Lara turned it over. Her mother's handwriting, the same tight, careful letters Ingrid had always written, the handwriting of a woman who did not waste words. The message was short. I could hear the code. I learned it as a girl the same way you did at your grandmother's kitchen table. I heard every letter. I could copy at 10 words per minute by the time I was 12. I chose to stop listening. I told myself the wire was a cage. Maybe it was a door. I do not know. I am not coming back. But I wanted you to know that I heard it. I always heard it. Elara read the postcard twice. She set it on the desk beside Stellan's sounder, between the 2 photographs: Stellan in 1920, Margit in 1967, and she looked at the 3 things together. 2 operators at their desks. 1 postcard from a woman who had heard the wire and walked away. 3 generations. 3 choices. All of them real. She did not cry. She did not call Waterloo. She understood that the postcard was not an apology and was not a reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement. Ingrid was saying, I heard the wire. I chose not to listen, and the choice was mine. The acknowledgement was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. Tommy Dahl started coming to the depot in May. He was 14 years old, Mrs. Dahl's son, a quiet boy with large hands and a stillness about him that reminded Elara of Walt Egan. He came down the section road on his bicycle after school, leaned the bicycle against the platform, and walked into the waiting room and sat on the bench beside the stove. He did not ask to learn the code. He sat and listened to the sounder when Elara practiced the way Margit had sat on the bench in the Kalmar depot and listened to Mr. Kowalski's sounder through the ticket window. After a week of this, Elara said, "Do you want to try?" Tommy nodded. She sat him at the kitchen table. She had brought a small table into the telegraph office by then beside the desk, and had set up Margit's J38 key and a practice sounder on it, and she went into the waiting room and pressed the key. Click, click, a short click, and a long click. "What did you hear?" Ilara called through the doorway. Tommy listened. He was very still. "A," he said. "Dot dash. That is A." She pressed again. Click. One short click. "E," Tommy said. He did not guess. He knew. Ilara stood in the waiting room doorway and looked at the boy sitting at the table beside the telegraph desk, and she understood that this was the thing Stellan had meant. Connect it to the next person. The wire does not die if someone is listening. She taught Tommy the way Margit had taught her. By sound. By rhythm. By the patient, steady repetition of patterns until the patterns became letters, and the letters became words, and the words became a language that the boy could hear without thinking. Tommy learned fast. Faster than Ilara had learned. By June, he could copy at 5 words per minute, and his hand on the key was steady, and his spacing was clean. And when he made a mistake, he caught it himself because Ilara had taught him what Margit had taught her. Listen not just for the code, but for the sense. Walt Egan still came on Saturdays. The heavy repairs were done now. Mercer's crew had handled the structural work, but Walt came anyway. He replaced a window sash. He oiled the freight door track. He built a wooden shelf above the telegraph desk for the message journal. Small work. The work of a man who did not want to stop coming to a place where his presence mattered. One Saturday in June, Walt and Ilara sat on the platform in the late afternoon sun, and Tommy was inside practicing on the key, and the sound of the sounder came through the open door. Slow, deliberate clicks, the sound of a boy learning a language. Walt listened. He drank his coffee. He looked at the old track bed running into the green hills, the rails buried in grass, the telegraph poles leaning the cross arms bare. "I drove trains for 35 years, Walt said. "I retired 8 years ago. My wife Ruth died 6 years ago. I have a trailer 10 miles from here and a pension and a truck, and nothing to do with my hands." He paused. "When Brennan told me there was a girl living in the old Lindqvist depot fixing it up, I drove out here because I wanted to see the depot. I had driven past it 1,000 times, and I had never stopped. And I thought before I die, I should stop at the place where the person who kept me alive used to sit." He looked at Ilara. "I did not expect to find someone sitting at the desk." The sounder clicked inside the depot. Tommy was sending a word. Walt listened to the clicks, and his eyes changed, and Ilara saw something in them she had not seen before. Not sadness, not nostalgia, but gratitude. The gratitude of a man who had spent his life depending on a sound he had never understood, and who was hearing that sound again in a depot he had passed 1,000 times, made by a boy who was learning the language that had kept him alive. "I never said thank you," Walt said. 35 years of train orders, 35 years of depending on the operator. And I never said thank you, not to the operator, not to anyone. He set his coffee cup on the platform. "Thank you," he said. He did not say it to Ilara. He said it to the depot, to the desk, to the sounder, to the wire. On a clear evening in late October, Ilara sat on the depot platform and watched the last copper light fade across the old track bed. The rails were rusted and half buried in grass, running straight into the distance, vanishing into the hills that were gold and red with autumn. The telegraph poles still stood along the right-of-way, leaning cross-arms. Bare the wire, long gone, but the poles were there, marking the path the words had traveled. Inside the depot, the pot-bellied stove ticked with the rhythm of cooling iron. The telegraph desk held two keys, Margit's J38 and Stellan's brass key, side by side on the oak surface. Two instruments that had spoken the same language on the same wire. The message journal hung open on the shelf above the desk, open to the first entry. June 3rd, 1889. First message received at this station. Marquette to Lindqvist Depot. Test. Stop. Can you hear me? Stop. I pressed the key and sent, yes, stop. I hear you, stop. The wire is alive. The two photographs hung on the wall beside the journal. Stellan in 1920, Margit in 1967. Operators at their desks, listening. Ingrid's postcard stood propped between them, a small rectangle of white cardboard, with a Waterloo postmark bearing the handwriting of a woman who had heard the wire and walked away, and wanted her daughter to know that the hearing had been real. In the waiting room, Tommy Dahl sat at the practice table. He had been coming every afternoon for 5 months now, and he could copy at 12 words per minute and send at 10, and his rhythm was clean and even, and he no longer looked at the key when he sent, because his wrist had learned the motion, the way Margit's wrist had learned it, the way Stellan's wrist had learned it, by doing the thing 10,000 times, until the doing was as natural as breathing. Tommy was sending a message. Ilara could hear the clicks through the open doorway carried on the warm air from the stove, floating out onto the platform where she sat in the October light. The clicks were slow but sure. Each dot and each dash formed with care, with the spacing that Margit had called the operator's handwriting. Tommy's handwriting was still young, careful, deliberate, the handwriting of a boy who was learning to trust what his hand could do. She listened. She did not need to see the key or the sounder. She heard the rhythm, and the rhythm became letters, and the letters became words. Dot, 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 dash, dot, dash, dot, I, H, E, A, R, dash, dot, dash, dot, dash, 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 dot, dash, dash, dot, 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 dash, dot, Y, O, U, I hear you. Ilara sat on the platform and listened to the words come through the doorway, click by click, the same words that had traveled through copper wire for 100 years. The same words that Stellan had sent into a dead wire on September 14th, 1934. The same words that Margit had heard through a ticket window when she was 5 years old. The same words that Mr. Kowalski had spoken on Margit's first day behind the desk. The sounder speaks the same words that had carried train orders and death notices and birth announcements and the news of an armistice across the prairies of Iowa. Walt Egan's truck was parked beside the platform. Walt was leaning against the fender, a cup of coffee in his hand. His seed cap pushed back on his white hair. He was listening too. He did not know the code. He could not read the clicks. But he could hear the rhythm, and the rhythm was steady and clean. And the rhythm was the sound of a boy learning the language that had once kept Walt alive, and that was enough for Walt. That was everything. The last light faded. The hills went dark. The telegraph poles stood against the sky like sentinels marking the path. The words had traveled from Marquette to Kalmar, to the old branch siding where a depot stood, and a sounder clicked, and a girl had found a desk, and a dead man's letter, and a deed to 2 acres of Iowa ground, and a language made of dots and dashes that carried not messages but trust. Elara Voss was 22 years old, and she had been homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she had spent it on an old railway depot on a siding in northeast Iowa. It was the best $10 she ever spent. Inside the depot, the sounder clicked once more, and then it was quiet, and the quiet was not silence. The quiet was the space between the clicks, the pause that gives the code its meaning, the rest that makes the rhythm whole. The wire was alive.